Beginning in the 5th century of England, and in some circles continuing up until the present time, an annual ceremony was conducted in the course of springtime rogation days and their prayers for a prosperous harvest. This concurrent festival was called Beating the Bounds and was a part ceremonial, part functional undertaking in which the local priest or a large landholder, in the company of a group of prominent citizens, walked the boundary lines of the parish or manor in order to keep those lines remembered, established, handed down. It could happen, after all, that boundary stones could get knocked down or be damaged or upended by winter heavings. It could also happen that greedy, less scrupulous neighbors could intentionally move a marker to their own advantage. Beating the bounds, then, was a festive, ceremonial way of keeping everybody on the up and up about what is what, and ensuring that the lines were communally maintained and perpetuated. Not all such lines we need to beat, of course, are geographic. Some are moral, some are cultural, some are simple interpersonal conventions, but in whatever category they are, we are more comfortable knowing where they are. A couple of weeks ago, while traveling to pick up our grandson to stay with us for a week, I pulled off the road in some small southeastern Missouri town for lunch. Among the very few available options, I chose a sonic drive-in and angled into a parking spot. I managed to accomplish my order, and when the car hop brought my food to the window, I stammered in response to her question if there was anything else I needed. I groped. I haven't been to a Sonic in close to 50 years. I don't know the rules. These were, in other words, bounds I had never beaten. She looked kind of quizzical for a moment and then intuitively responded, you mean about tipping? Some people give us cash tips. I was relieved. I felt like an idiot, and in that case I was, but I did want to do the right thing. I just didn't know what the right thing to be. I think that's a common awkwardness about more substantial issues, certainly, than the protocols of a drive-in burger joint. We like to know what's expected of us, the rubrics, the criteria by which we will be evaluated. Some things are easy. Traffic laws are straightforward, whether or not we actually follow them. There are manuals for such things. Driver's ed teaches us about signs and protocols about who has the right of way in a given circumstance and when it's okay to turn right on red. And we tend to pick up social customs without too much trouble, learning pretty early on that "how are you doing" is rarely a literal question, that "please" is generally followed by "thank you." But in other matters, the expectations are less clear, and depending on our various allegiances, they often compete. American citizenship, for example, carries with it privileges, to be sure, but also responsibilities. Some of those are ceremonial, like taking off your hat during the playing of the national anthem, like learning the Pledge of Allegiance and appropriately honoring the flag. But there are subtler ones, more about ethos than ceremony. Values constructs prioritized by our communal history and self-image. Things like strength and independence, self-reliance and ambition. Things like maximizing profit to serve the accumulation of wealth. But what happens when we simultaneously know ourselves to be family members, as well as citizens? What happens when our country's norms and expectations of us collide with our family's circumstances and needs? Or perhaps more complicated still, what happens when we are people of faith, adherents of one or another religious belief system? What do we do when our religious expectations of us conflict with the claims of our citizenship? Now, I know that in our country, we like to delude ourselves into thinking there is no conflict between our faith and our country, that our interests are always aligned. But of course, we really know that isn't the case. Honest, forthright reflection doesn't need much time to generate a long list of conflicts. But I'll not get into that. That's your business. Suffice it to say that it's complicated. And whatever we make of them and however we seek to reconcile them, at the very least, we want to know what those rules are. That's the way I read the Old Testament book of Leviticus. Maybe not the most inspirational chapters in the Bible, but useful to the children of Israel in the adolescence of learning what it means to be faithful in this situation or that. And then there was the time, at an individual level, when a man approached Jesus and asked him to put all those rules and regulations into a nutshell. By way of response, Jesus reached back into that vast Jewish law book and extracted two. You shall love the Lord your God with your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets, Jesus said, hang on these two commandments. Love. Love God, love others, love yourselves. Love as I have loved you. As the Apostle Paul would later and famously reflect on it, faith and hope and love remain. But the greatest of these, he concluded, is love. On the one hand, it sounds pretty simple. Simply love. But it's never really quite that simple, is it? Love, especially given the way that word has deteriorated into little more than marshmallow fluff in our collective imagination, especially in contrast to all those other competing rubrics into which we can so much more easily and more glamorously sink our teeth and invest our energies, all those other boundary lines that are far simpler to walk. But there it is. Love. Time and time again in this book, we assert in one way or another to contain God's very breath is this commandment to love. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor. Love yourself. Love your enemy, for crying out loud. If you love only those who love you, Jesus asked, what good is that? Love, then, far from some sweet whipped creamy drizzle or romantic schmaltz, turns out to be a whole mess of very hard work. The very most important, very hard work, demanding, difficult, countercultural, frankly, maybe even at times unpatriotic. Love. And here, then, in this letter to the Romans, Paul sharpens the point even finer. All that finally matters, he says, the only debt you owe is love. I just want to let that sit there for a moment, pondering how that would change our lives, how it would change the tone of our political discourse, how it would change our attentions to preventing the spread of this virus if we paid that one single debt to one another and to the God who made us. Yes, 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 I can hear you saying, but there are many ways to love. Which is the correct one? Or is there, after all, a correct one? To which I respond, that's absolutely true. Primarily, it's true because love is indeed situational and is finally defined by the recipient, not the giver. I mean, we're prone to rationalization, self-justification. My intentions were loving, we're prone to say, but that's hardly a useful defense. It isn't the pitch that matters. What matters is how it lands. If the recipient doesn't receive it as loving, it's a miss. If the recipient receives the act as an act of love, it is. And that's the only relevant measure. Love, Paul writes, does no wrong to a neighbor. He goes on to say, we don't have time for anything less. And so, he says, pay the debt. This one is the only one we owe. A number of years ago, I was visiting a faithful parishioner named Una Ray, who at that time was a patient in one of the hospice facilities in town on what would prove to be her final day of life. Because she was sleeping, or at least appeared to be sleeping, I was mostly talking with her daughter seated nearby, when all of a sudden, Una Ray interrupted, sitting bolt upright in bed, and began to talk with as much clarity as conviction. She'd had a vision, she told me, and she finally understood the truth about life. It really is, it turns out, all about love, she said. And with that, she sank back into her bed, asleep, and then that night, she died. Now, I don't know. Maybe it was the medication. Or who knows, maybe it was hallucination. Maybe it was, in fact, truthfully, a vision. And maybe she was passing along to any who might be close enough to listen this ultimate truth that she had received, that finally is the truth about life, that it's all about love, that when everything is said and done, there really is but this one debt. Beth Nielsen Chapman is a Nashville-based Grammy Award singer-songwriter whose songs have been recorded by the likes of Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings and Bonnie Raitt and Neil Diamond and Elton John and the Indigo Girls, among others, including Faith Hill with her blockbuster hit, This Kiss. I like all those songs. I like Beth. But among her vast catalog of songs is one that has gotten far less airtime than some of her award-winning songs, but one in which I begin to hum just about every time I pick up and read the Bible and stumble yet again over its relentless reference to this holy obligation. Sometimes we forget, she sings, trying to be so strong in this world of right and wrong. All that matters when we're gone, all that mattered all along, all we have that carries on is how we love. She is absolutely right in singing the single debt we owe.